Good morning. Welcome to Anthropology 4310, Theories of Culture. I'm Norris Lang, and I'm in the Anthropology department here at the University of Houston, and I've never done anything like this before, so if I appear a little nervous, it's because I am. And this morning, we're going to go through some introductory comments, obviously, about the course, and also go with you through the syllabus for the course so you more readily understand what some of the requirements for the course are, and also to let you know what you're responsible for and whom to contact when you're having problems so that we can better facilitate interaction between myself and the students. If you'll look at your syllabus, you'll see that my name and office is there, my telephone number and office hours, and my email address. And email address is probably the most important part of all that, because that's what you would use primarily to get in touch with me. The other important item of information in that part of the syllabus is the name of the teaching assistant, Mr. Sean Webb. Mr. Webb is a master's candidate in our department in cultural anthropology, and he has assisted me in this course once before, and so I thought he would make an ideal assistant for the class this time. And his email address is also included, as well as his address, his office address. And if you don't have access to a computer, the phone number is there where you can leave a message for him, and his office hours, etc. And this is a course that covers the historical development of anthropology. It goes through the various historical periods of anthropology, and it relies on a very important assumption, and that is there's some kind of connectivity, some kind of connection between anthropology and the history of the people who produce anthropology. And so when events occur that are of major importance in changing the direction that a people take, it also has implications, it has an impact on the development of anthropological ideas and the development of the way anthropologists do things. As I say in the syllabus, this could just as easily be a course on the relativity of theory or the anthropology of anthropology, because it's really an attempt for us to look at anthropologists as a cultural anthropologist might look at a culture or a subculture of a larger, more complex society. There are 4 textbooks for the course. I won't go over those in any detail since they are on your syllabus, except to say that the first one is probably the most important in terms of giving you a roadmap or clues where to go with the readings. It's an excellent book. It has introductions to the articles, and then the articles are written by the scholars that will be talking about themselves. So you not only get somebody's assessment of what they're saying about a particular author's work, then you also get to follow that up with reading an exact example of that work. So that's the book by anthropologists McGee and Warms, and is called Anthropological Theory, An Introductory History, and it's available in the bookstore if you don't already have it purchased. And then the other books are listed there, and I won't go through them. The first half of this course is going to consist of, roughly half, is going to consist of lecture discussions. In other words, I'll have the lecture, you have the discussion, or we have the discussion, and it will cover roughly three periods in the history of anthropology. I think one of the most forceful things or interesting things, or something I didn't really appreciate early in my career, was that anthropology really didn't start until the middle of the last century. And we're really kind of entering a period now where we can say anthropology as a discipline has been around for 150 years. Well, since I'm 60, that's not very long in my mind. So it's a relatively young discipline, and as a separate discipline with a name. Now, there were anthropologists, people who talked about anthropology before that time, but there wasn't a department of anthropology anywhere in the country. There wasn't anyone who had the title anthropologist anywhere in this country. And by the way, this course is primarily about American anthropology, although it does talk about British anthropology somewhat, and when appropriate, other subcultures of anthropology in terms of their geographical origins. Roughly what my lectures will cover will be 3 periods in the history of anthropology. It will cover the 19th century and evolutionary anthropology. And this is in your syllabus, so you don't have to take that much notes right now, unless you just want to. And it will cover cultural relativism, the school of American anthropology led by Franz Boas. And then it will also discuss, because it's important to know this, is functionalism and the British school of anthropology. And one of the reasons that that becomes important in a course such as this is that 2 of the main protagonists for functionalist theory in anthropology from Britain spent a great part of their career in the United States. One at the University of Texas, another at the University of Chicago. And in that time period, they influenced our field and our way of thinking. For example, Radcliffe Brown at the University of Chicago, his impact came in, if you ever look at the School of Sociology at the University of Chicago, Robert Merton, etc., you'll find that the impact of anthropology is there in British anthropology and functionalism. And it's an important event in our own history and the direction that it took our anthropologists and our students, even to this present day. And that's one of the assumptions that I make, is that by looking at these 3 approaches to anthropology, these 3 historical approaches, these 3 approaches from the past, you really have then a firm basis for understanding all ideas in anthropology. You know, I've heard people take, for example, any idea that's ever been proposed by an anthropologist, and they've been able to translate it into functionalism. Functionalist seems to have that kind of universal capability. So if you see that kind of thing, or that kind of treatment, or that application, remember you heard it here first. All right, once we have had those 3 approaches to anthropology, historical approaches, examined in some detail, then you'll have a midterm take-home exam, which I will give you, will be distributed on the 14th and will be due back to us by the 21st. And for the particulars of that, again, you can look to your syllabus about the dates and stuff and what it covers. So in this context, then, I want to talk just real briefly now what the 4 requirements for the course are. There are 2 take-home exams, one given in the midterm and one given during the final exam period. They're distributed ahead of time, and then you're given so much time to get them back to us. And for example, the one that's distributed on the 14th and then it's due back to us by the 21st, we in no way expect you to spend all of that week on nothing but that exam. Because that's just the time frame in which you find time to do that exam. Ideally, I would say it will probably take you twice as long in terms of your writing as it might take you for an exam if you were taking it in class. And by twice as long, it's because your ideas are better written, because you have more time to ferret them out and think them through. You also have, access to all your textbooks, all your notes. This is not a guessing game. Hopefully your exams become a means by which you learn more anthropology and more about the history of theory than it is about trying to catch you or get you when you're not thinking about it. As you know, also, there is another component of the class, home viewing, who watch this. I assume they're going to tape it. I assume they're not going to get up at 3:30 in the morning and watch it. And they have the same requirements that you do. So you have the 2 take-home exams, essay, and then you have a class paper. You choose a living anthropologist, one who's alive, because a lot of times it's questionable, and so you have to make sure they're alive. And the reason I want you to do a live anthropologist is not to give you an anthropologist for whom acquiring the information is more difficult. I really would like for you to attempt to contact the anthropologist you've selected. Now, in most cases, you're going to be successful. And then you want to have your questions written down ahead of time, so when you get them on the phone, or you get them on email, because that's, I think, primarily where you'll be able to contact them more readily. Then you want to know what you're going to be asking them. And, you would introduce that by saying, that you're in this class, you're doing it for a class project, you've selected them out because you've admired their work, you've read some of their articles, et cetera, and in most cases I think you'll get a favorable response. If you don't get a favorable response, you can include that in your paper. But anyway, many times they will send you their curriculum vitae and other items. They'll even send you reprints of some articles and stuff like that. It's a way of introducing yourself in a world of professionals, and you're being a professional, and you're starting your own networking, your own way of establishing yourself in our discipline. So you have that paper, and again the details are there, and you focus on one anthropologist and you talk about their works and summarize their ideas. And you get that primarily from the readings and from that are assigned and from the course lecture notes, but there's also, if you're choosing your anthropologist, you would want to look at their work in addition in the library or wherever you find the sources. And when you have questions about the paper or any other item, you would bring them to either Mr. Webb or myself. And I think the best way to do it, if you have access to television or to a computer, is to use email. If not, we're happy to see you in any other form, also either by phone or by an office appointment. So you have the paper, 2 take-home exams, and then the 4th one is probably the one that sounds the most difficult. And it will be in terms of logistics, but it's also, I think, the most rewarding. And that's where you will do a class presentation. In the past, these have been dramatic skits bordering on theatrical productions that have been excellent, that on the face of it don't sound like that the students are being that serious about anthropology, but when it comes down to it, when you look at them, when you see what they've done, when you've seen them construct those ideas and take them from the various sources that we have and bring them into that kind of portrayal, and it doesn't have to be dramatic, it can also be somewhat straightforward and academic. You can grow to be as boring as we are. But that's up to you, and that's up to your group, what you want to do in that. Most of I think the productions will be taped in this room. It wouldn't necessarily be during class time. I don't know how we do that. I guess for you in this part of the class, the live class, as it were, you'll be doing them at the day that it's scheduled in terms of doing it right in here during class time. It's the home viewing audience that have to arrange for their taping at other times, or sometimes they'll have to come in and join you if they happen to be in your group. So that may be the only contact that we have from now on with those viewers, and we certainly welcome their input and want them to work with you in terms of providing these what will be taped productions. So that's essentially the 4 basic requirements of the course. Any other details are in your syllabus, and you can look it through, and if you have questions later on, you can ask either myself or Mr. Webb about it. And then you'll find that there is, at the end of all those remarks about the requirements for the course and the bases for grading, there is the class schedule, and August 24th class begins, and that's today, and we have. And then the lectures from now on will be up to the midterm, and they will cover these various components in the history of anthropology that I just mentioned. 19th century evolutionism. They'll also cover historical particularism, culture and personality, structuralism and functionalism, and that would then take us up to the midterm. After that, it will be the student presentations and several guest lectures that I am arranging from other members of the department. So this will not just be a one-person production plus the students. It's also going to involve other anthropologists in the department as well. Dr. Rasmussen, for example, is going to give us some guest lectures, as well as Dr. Brown, Dr. Widmer, and then a graduate student that I have become acquainted with who has really impressed me with his knowledge and devotion, really, to this area of anthropology known as postmodernism. And so I have asked him to give the lecture on postmodernism, which would be near the end of the course, and would give that particular point of view. It's an important point of view. It's a current point of view. It's a lot where a lot of ethnological or anthropological, culturally anthropologists are. It's not necessarily my point of view. It's not where I think anthropology necessarily should be, but then they never have done things the way I want them to. But it is important. It is where a lot of the new ideas are being created at this point. And then I will wait for this generation of anthropologists will eventually, their students will turn on them as previous generations students have turned on their teachers, and we'll get back to a more sensible and materialist perspective of anthropology. And that's a joke if you don't appreciate it. In other words, anthropologists do change their theoretical perspective from one period to the next, and it does usually go by generation. And one of the things, I'm going to give you a materialist notion now, and that is that when anthropological ideas change, it isn't because there's an anthropologist sitting somewhere in his office or out in the field doing work, be they of the linguistic, biological, archaeological, or ethnological type, and suddenly, you know, as a result of groundbreaking ideas, they change their point of view. No, anthropologists die, and succeeding generation of students take their place, and it's usually in that succession of anthropologists that new ideas become more prevalent and grow in importance and grow in significance, and then it waits for that generation to, quote, move on, as it were, for another generation of anthropologists gives their ideas or presents their notions. So, that might sound jaded, but it is, I think, primarily where change in a discipline comes from. It's, again, that anthropologists have certain lifespans like everyone else, and when their lifespans come to an end, so does that view of anthropology. One of my major professors, for example, was a man named Julian Stewart, whom you may have heard of, some of you, and you probably will know fairly well by the time this course is over. One would have thought that Julian Stewart would have created lots of little Julian Stewarts, and we would all be running around talking about Stewart said this and Stewart said that. And I find that's true of my archaeological colleagues. They're always talking about Julian Stewart, and neither one of them had him as a professor, but they did have Robert Sanders as a professor who was a student of Julian Stewart, as I understand it. And so he's discussed quite often, but he's not discussed in the sense that they're just recreating his notions and his ideas. I know in Dr. Brown's case, he recreates Stewart in the sense, and Sanders in the sense that he brings that materialist view of archaeology towards a kind of social constructionist point of view, where he's taking materialist notions and seeing if he can look at the material aspects of a society or culture and then reconstruct, maybe, or at least give us a credible sense of what their social life may have been like, and even some of what their cultural notions might have been. Although in many cases it has to be left in the area of what we call speculation. It's nonetheless based on solid materialist archaeological evidence. That's will serve as those kind of brief remarks about the syllabus and what's required of you. All right, the basic notion in this class from day one until the final day is that there is this connection then between history and anthropological culture. And that indeed anthropology is really a byproduct of Western history and the Western experience. If you took a course in anthropology from a different area of the world, it would not sound that familiar as to what we would present in a course in this class or in this department or in this area of the world. Anthropology does vary that way, but essentially it's in this history that we have, and a history that you already know something about, but have probably never thought about it in terms of the production or generation of anthropologists and anthropological ideas. But for example, anthropology is a byproduct of the Western experience of first conquering other peoples, as our ancestors did in terms of European and later on American, and then colonizing those areas, and then later those areas becoming independent or separate from us. But in that antagonism, in that effort to control other areas of the world, our European ancestors gave us anthropology, and that's where anthropology comes from. And I think that's why it's particularly a byproduct of the cultural evolution of Western history. And again, we'll be primarily talking about American anthropology and, to a lesser extent, British anthropology. But I think it's important, before I go on and give you some other of the other premises of our course, basic premises, basic outlook, is for you to know something about me, something about my anthropological background, what I was trained in, why I say the things that I do, why I have the particular point of view that I do. And this will then prevent anyone from selecting me as the person whom they choose for their living anthropologist, because you'll already have this information in the lecture. I came from the Midwest. I come from the Midwest. My parents, my father was a truck driver. My mother was a farmer's daughter, proverbially, and in Indiana. And they, as a young married couple, moved to Illinois. They were an unusual couple for that time and that period in history. My mother was born in 1902, and my father was born in 1916. So he's 13 years older than my mother. That's very unusual. The other thing that's very unusual about them is that my mother was divorced. And that was unusual, as I'm sure most of you realize. And she's what we would today call a single parent. She had a 10-year-old son, and she was 13 years older than my father when she met him. So she had interesting experiences with some of that impacted on my own life and influenced the anthropologist that I eventually became. They became Baptists. I didn't. I was a more comfortable Presbyterian, and wish things would remain that way, not to jar me, nothing to upset me, and I didn't certainly want to think about the kinds of things that Baptists talk about. So when they became Baptists, I tended to start withdrawing from organized religion and search for my own destiny, my own set of ideas. I was going to do it my own and do it my way, and we all, some of you are going through that now, and in psychology, I think they call it individuation. In our own lives, we probably call it emotional angst or anxiety or something. But anyway, I grew up in the Midwest in Illinois. I went to the University of Illinois because it was the university just over the way. I didn't realize it was one of the best universities in the country. I just knew it was down the road and that would be an easy one to go to. And since I was a state resident, I would also have cheaper tuition, etc. So when I got there, there were all kinds of anthropologists there. Although I didn't start off in anthropology, actually, and I think that comes out. My first choice as a major was philosophy. And then I became a chemistry major, and then I became an anthropology major. So I had all those things in my background. I had philosophy, which is a humanistic kind of point of view, generally speaking, at least in terms of the evolution of ideas. And then there's the chemistry, which is solidly in the materialist camp, or the natural science approach. And then I followed that up with anthropology, which seemed to be a combination of all those. One of the things about anthropology, one of the reasons that it appealed to me was its breadth of scope. The fact that it included the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and the fine arts. All of those things are appropriate and apt topics for an anthropologist to look at. And that suited me to a T, given the breadth and the variety of background that I'd had at that point. It's not that at that time at the University of Illinois, it was easier to declare a major. Unlike today, you have all these courses that are specified. At that time, if you just had 20 hours in a discipline, then that was your major, if you so named it or designated it. And obviously you could also change it, which of course is what I did. I would take my 20 hours in a certain discipline and say, oh well, that was interesting, now what am I going to do? And I would change it to something else. And we didn't have a different set of requirements for those people in social sciences, and another set of requirements for people in natural sciences, and another set of requirements for people in the fine arts and humanities, as this university does. So it was easier to switch back and forth and first major in one, say, a scientific area of study, and then move to a more humanistic area of study or socially scientific area of study. The anthropology department at that time was kind of a new department, even though they had very, very big names there. people under whom students would come from all over the world to study under. Julian Stewart was there, as I've already mentioned. Oscar Lewis, who was well known because a lot of his monographs became Book of the Month Club selections, and in that context he had a very popular following as well as an academic following, and he was primarily responsible for this development of a notion called the culture of poverty, which was supposed to be applicable or attributable to third world peoples, especially those in third world countries that did not have access to power, who were the lower classes or the classes without political power or clout. And he made his career developing that particular concept and using that notion to talk about ethnography and give you the description of the daily lives of people who were at the kind of the bottom of the social ladder in such countries as Mexico, Cuba, and other areas of Latin America. There were important archaeologists there. One of the it was a different kind of archaeology, I think, in prominence at that time. Most of you, many of you rather, have had some kind of archaeology or have taken courses, and you know processual archaeology versus post-processual and all those kinds of distinctions. Well, this time they didn't have that kind of stuff necessarily. It was just in the making, and I remember one archaeologist was John McGregor, who was a Southwestern specialist, and when you took his classes, you went into the class and they would have in front of you all these potsherds, just little pieces of pottery, and that had been broken and were artifacts that they had recovered from one dig or another, and they would be stored in these tall cases, and they'd pull, if you wanted to know what the decorative styles were for the Mogollon people at, say, 1100 AD, you just pull that shelf out and there they would be. But then it really became a tedious process when I took those courses, because that's what the course was about. It was looking at those intricate little pieces of pottery, those little potsherds, and take them and just describe them. Describe what they were made of, describe what the ornamentation was. And for a whole semester that can get a bit tedious, and it did. And so that was my impression of archaeologists, and I didn't want to have anything to do with them. I thought, now that's not what the kind of anthropology that I want. I want something that's more, that's bigger than that. And looking at the work of Julian Stewart, I knew I had found something bigger, because he talked about the whole evolution of culture, the whole, if you will, the larger picture, the bigger scope, the kind of things that talks about the universal structures and the development of human behavior and human civilization, or civilizations. All right, in this, the field was, the department that I received my graduate education in was decidedly materialist in its notions. They had just gone through a period, as you'll later understand better, of cultural relativism, of looking at the diversity of culture. Now, the vocabulary I use today in lecture about those topics might be reflective more of current notions, because we talk a lot today about cultural diversity. But they would talk about the same things, they just might have talked about it using a different vocabulary, because they would have used the vocabulary of that time. That's one of the most difficult things to do, even if you've lived through all these periods, and with the exception of 19th century cultural evolution, I have. I wasn't alive in the 19th century yet, though. Although, no, we won't go there. It's very difficult to go back and recreate those periods of thought, how people stated things, how they vocalized things, how they thought. All I can do is kind of grasp for you the kind of abstract notions, the kind of characterization, if you will, a profile of what their particular anthropology was about, their particular theory of culture, their particular perception or perspectives on human behavior. But it is difficult to give it to you in a real sense. And sometimes that's actually better. Because I know in the library here at the University of Houston, there is a film by Margaret Mead. And I can't remember, I think it's called Four Cultures. and it's so old I don't know if they can find it now, but it's there. It's in the University of Houston's collection of films that they used to have. I assume it's been by this time transposed to tape. I don't know when the last time it would be, though, that it would have been checked out. That would be the next question. But when I see that, I'm just embarrassed. I cringe. And then I realized that when I first came to anthropology, this is also what drew me to anthropology. And the reason I say that is because she sounds terribly naive, and she sounds terribly wrong. But what I forget is that I've been a professional anthropologist for almost 40 years now. And in that 40 years' time, the discipline has changed quite a bit. The way I view the discipline has changed dramatically. And so, of course, she sounds like a voice from a different generation, a different time. And when I think back at that time, I kind of make it relevant to current anthropology and what people are saying today. But if you hear her say it and talk about it, it becomes this thing where did she get that absurd notion? Anyway, in this film called Four Cultures, a lot of her early work was done at a time when we were involved in, the American people were involved in the Second World War in one capacity or another, and certainly we scholars did not have access to different cultures of the world in certain areas of the world, so that they were prohibited from kind of empirical studies, as it were. And in that context, she and others with her, Ruth Benedict being prominent, would develop this notion or this concept of anthropology at a distance. And it suffers from all the things that you can think of anthropology as a distance. I would call it stereotyping anthropology, because that's really what I heard when I read some of those accounts. And if you read some of the monographs written at that time or from that era, and we'll talk about that in greater detail later, their characterization of another people, it was kind of one-dimensional or just two-dimensional. There was no real depth to it, because it was, again, being anthropology at a distance, they had to take what they could get from newspaper accounts, from literature. There was, in many cases, they would be accounts by people who were well-educated, who were in the political and ruling class of the country, if not by position, by connection or relationship or kinship. It was a very one-sided view of what life was about in those countries and those cultures among those peoples, and what would be an adequate characterization, even if we were going to say that an appropriate tool for an anthropologist to use is generalizing about a people's behavior or a way of living in a certain other area of the world. In this case, I think they went too far based on too little. And so you hear that in this movie, Four Cultures, and it appalls me because, number one, she's generalizing from the studies of relatively, in this context, simple people, simple in the terms of the kind of technology that they had, and then she would generalize to all of Africa. And I just sit there, I cringe when I see it, right? And I don't know if that's what she intended, but that's what she said. And then they had one African family, and they had one family from Canada. And Canada, that family, which was it was a western rural family in Manitoba or some such, where I hope that's in the west of Canada, I have no idea. Either that or Saskatchewan. I know Saskatchewan is in the west. And that rural family of two parents and two children, a son and a daughter, became the stereotypical family unit, much as sociologists have done to characterize American family structure in the West and in the United States in previous times. And she generalizes on that Canadian family to all of the United States, on all of North America. And again, it appalled me. It made me speechless. I'm embarrassed to show it in class. Although it could have been a good exercise in this class to view that film. And if you're interested, as I say, I think it's available, and all you'd have to do is check it out and view it on your VCR. But not to stick with that too long, it's just to say that, different generations had different ideas, and it's very difficult when we create those. I go through, like, say, a particular period of history of anthropology, say 19th century, and I give you those ideas. But, I really would like to make them come alive. I would like to have you experience anthropology as a 19th century person might have. But I can only do that to a certain extent because we're all caught up and we're all kind of imprisoned, as it were, by the period of history in which we live. You know, we're born into the world, we start interacting with those people and events around us, and we become byproducts of that. And we don't realize that, you know, what history really means, what really it took us to get to this point in time, what's different about previous chapters in the history of anthropology, and what was different about the people and the kinds of ideas that they expressed and the kinds of events that they were exposed to. You know, it makes for a much different reading, and I think when you read the selections in your textbook from previous times, and if you have those notions in mind, it might give you a greater appreciation for what it is that you are reading. Remember that in the 19th century, these were the people that first started talking about other peoples, and other is underlined because they did talk about the other. Other has been a concept that has for a long time been an important concept, not distinguished, not made distinctive by anthropologists until recently. But that's really, it's the study of the other, the study of people who we thought were different from us. And that's where anthropology came from, and that's where those early anthropological notions were based on, was variety, distinctiveness, and something not like ourselves. And there are two basic questions that all anthropologists ask. I don't know if they ever get the answers, but they all ask them. Each generation of anthropologists asks them. In other words, these two questions transcend any one historical period in anthropology. They're as relevant and current today as they were whenever the first person was that asked them. It might have been Socrates, it could have been Hippocrates, could have been any of those earlier Greeks, but certainly every generation of people who name themselves and call themselves anthropologists have had these questions. The first one is, what is universal about human behavior? Is there such a, and this is a related question, is there such a notion that has some kind of viability that is human nature? If you ever have trouble talking to your parents about anthropology and what you're studying, just bring up the topic of human nature and they'll readily and quickly be able to give you their point of view or version of it. Because this is really the heart of what anthropologists talk about and what anthropologists, their beginning point, as it were, how they are kind of at a point of departure from all other academic disciplines. They are the experts, if you will, on human nature. All right, once you've asked that question, what's universal about human nature, in the earlier Western notions, you're kind of really talking about, you know, what if I looked at all people in the world, what can I say they all share in common? I remember taking a course as a graduate student once in language and cultural cognition, or the ethnography of language, or some such thing. I can't remember what it was called now. It was actually a course given by my own major professor, which means the professor I chose to work under for my dissertation. His name was Joseph Casagrande, and one of his areas of specialization was linguistic diversity, linguistic ethnography, looking at various peoples around the world and talking about their ethnography from a linguistic perspective, and looking at their culture from the point of view of how the language they spoke shaped it. And so that impact is in my anthropology as well. But in so doing that, he would talk about these various things, and he would put forth this notion that, you know, that as language varies, so does human nature. So one of the things that he had as a division in his syllabus was linguistic universals. And he was trying to come up with all the languages of the world, what could he say about them that had universal utility, had universal application, that no matter which language you were studying or which language you were talking about, this one or these few points could be made. And I'm sorry for the people that have to look around the posts to see me. I guess you can look at the monitors. And in doing that, he had very few to give. I remember he tried once to say that, well, you know, there are lots of languages that have a syllable that has something to do with being a mother or motherhood. And guess what that syllable might be? Anybody? What do you think it would be? if you were just going to have one syllable and you were going to say that this has some kind of universal application to motherhood, what would you think it would be? Ma. Ma. You know, in other words, a bilabial stop, nasalized, and ma. And he would then give us different examples of languages throughout the world which would have that kind of notion, that would have that one syllable, and then the meaning of it somehow had something to do with motherhood. And of course that could have had something to do, he further speculated on nursing, you know, the fact that the lips come together in nursing and are making an action of sucking, and that might be where that ma comes from, and again that would be a part of the universal human experience. But there are actually, even using those linguistic notions that might have some degree of utility, there are very few things that you can say about languages of the world that have that kind of universal application. So that even though we have this notion of human nature, and anthropologists especially always think they know what they're talking about when they say human nature, when you come right down to it, I think anthropologists are primarily caught up in diversity, and always have been. Now, biological anthropologists may be in the other camp there. They may have a safer history, if you will, from the beginning of anthropology, at least my beginning of it, 1859. Which was the year that Darwin published his Origin of the Species. They may have had a safer history in the sense of they always focused on the biological characteristics of humans. So in that context, their notions of what it meant to be human or the human experience were based in the biological nature of being human. And that there is, readily we can see lots of biological similarities among all humans. And in fact, if you look at the biology, human beings seem to be more similar than they are dissimilar. I mean, the differences that occur are kind of irrelevant, biologically speaking. And I mean in the gross context, in the larger context. Of, you know, we all have two eyes, we all have two arms, etc., and that's considered the norm in all cultures. And in people who don't conform to that are considered there's a problem, there's something wrong with them. Even though in some cultures that's not always conceptualized as a problem. You know, sometimes what we consider to be problems aren't, but on the other hand, they would be considered to be apart from the normal. They would be considered to be even part of what I called earlier the other. But in that context of looking just at the biological characteristics, then we would see that most human beings seemingly share more than they don't share. So that if we have, for example, a group of people in Africa, that, for example, Northeast Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, they tend to be different than other peoples in Africa and other sections of that continent. But all people in that area, we have a certain level of generalization about what makes Africans Africans. Be these notions based on stereotypical notions, or be they based on notions that have been actually based on a collection of scientific evidence of their biological and genetic backgrounds. But it's difficult for those of us, and more difficult, I should say, for those of us in the other subdisciplines of anthropology, linguistics, ethnology, and archaeology, because this facile, easy generalization doesn't necessarily lend itself readily to our notions of human nature. We all think we know what humans are about. And anthropologists are always here to tell you what's the correct and politically correct notions of what humans are about. When we mean human nature. All of you in this room and in the home viewing audience have notions of what human nature means. You don't always, however, have a notion of human behavior that takes in the diversity, that takes in the complexity, and takes in the variety of human behavior that exists in the world today and in previous generations. And that's where anthropologists, I think, have something to offer. If they can't give us the answer to that first question, what is universal about human behavior, they can give us tons of evidence and details about the second question, which is in what ways are humans different from one another? And then an explanation trying to explain what those differences are based on. Be these differences biological, be they cultural, be they structural, be they spiritual, whatever area of human thought and behavior you want to focus on. All right, I've already mentioned to you that anthropology is a very broad discipline. I think a lot of social sciences especially make this claim. Anthropologists can readily substantiate it. I mean, there are anthropologists, for example, who study minute lithic tools. If you've ever been near Dr. Widmer's office, you want to be careful, because you might be sucked in by the vortex and you find yourself sitting at a little table ruining your eyes forever, picking out these teeny pieces and wondering if this piece of dirt is bone, a lithic tool, or part of a lithic tool, or something else that should be just thrown out. And sometimes, of course, mistakes are made. The wrong pieces are thrown away and the inappropriate pieces are retained. But, and again, I joke a lot, and so the jokes aren't necessarily funny jokes, but they're jokes, and don't take them seriously, especially when I'm talking about colleagues. But anyway, the breadth, so one person might be studying something like that. Another person might be, looking at baby language among the Comanche, a Native American Indian group. And not focusing on Comanche per se, the whole language of speaking Comanche, but rather, what do babies say? We have baby talk here. I don't know what you do with your kids if you have children, or what your family has done with children, or what they did to you or with you. But I know in English and in American culture and Western culture generally, you tend to repeat a syllable, and that's called baby talk. A dog becomes bow wow, a cat becomes a meow meow, a train becomes a choo choo. Well, what do other people do? And some of you know, especially those of us who are more psychologically astute, or maybe we've had some psychology training, we know we don't want to do that to our kids. We want to make them brilliant from day one. So we don't use baby talk with them. We talk with them as if they're a nuclear physicist of 40 years old, and that's the way they learn to speak then. And some psychologists come away thinking, gee, what wonderful children we have. They're so bright and creative. And of course, what all children are doing is mimicking their parents. So how their parents talk to them is how they speak. And so if people, which most people do, create a separate language for their children, then you're also underlying that as a basic cultural notion that children are different than adults. So they have to be talked to differently than adults are. So it's an important notion. And it's important, and it's a notion that has some kind of cross-cultural validity. So one anthropologist might be focusing just on that. And when people get down to the area of their research, as in any academic discipline, they really focus down so that only they and a few others have any real interest in what it is they're doing specifically. They want to know the general implications. They want to know what contribution it makes to the larger field of anthropology. But certainly, the person who's doing a study and analysis, say, of lithic materials has little to say to a person who's studying baby talk among Comanche Indians or Native Americans. Another anthropologist might be studying hair from certain populations, and looking at the characteristics of the hair and the texture, and what kind of genetic analysis can we make of that. And this is in the area, of course, of biological anthropology. I know one of the things that I'm always fascinated by Dr. Story's work. I don't know if any of you have ever talked to her or seen her in the lab working, but she has one person, and I can't remember his name, but it's a skeleton or partial skeletal construction of a person who was in a fire a long time ago. It's from an excavation, and she reconstructed him or put him together as much as one could, and then she makes certain kinds of inferences about that. Well, that's a fairly specialized area of study, and in her case, it relates very well because it's talking about morphology, morbidity, and it's talking about a prehistoric population. And a lot of her work is from the area of what is today Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, or it's about the work that she's done in Honduras, in that area of Central America. So that her work I find exceedingly interesting. She's a medical anthropologist. She's a physical anthropologist. She's also, by extension, an archaeologist, because a lot of her materials it comes from excavations, just the same as an archaeologist does. But she looks at it differently, and she's looking at a very much more narrow perspective of what all these things mean, these things that she has in her lab that she brings there and looks at under a microscope and whatever else she does. And but this is also anthropology. There's something that connects the person who does the lithic study of stone tools, the person who does the baby talk of Comanche Native Americans, and the person who studies hair and reconstruction of skeletal materials from an excavation a long time ago in prehistoric times. And what does it tell her about how people died then, what they died from? At what age did they die? What was the typical lifespan, for example, in Tenochtitlan at the time of contact, or even earlier, before contact with Western civilization or agents of Western civilization? And what was that all about? Well, she's the one to ask, because she's the one who does those kinds of studies. And her anthropology at that level of research, is very different from the other two that I've just characterized. And then, say, going to ethnology, or the kinds of things, say, maybe that I do. I have looked at sugar plantations in Ecuador, in coastal Ecuador, which is lowland Ecuador. It's a land management system that seems as much feudal as it does mechanized. It seems as much historical, going back to a much earlier time in history, as it does in terms of the technological basis for that plantation society, the mechanization of their productive arrangements, the fact that they're able to produce much more sugar now per acre, say, than they did in the past, when they used to grind the sugar using a mule, going around and around. And that wasn't that long ago. It was just the beginning of this century, actually, they had that form. And in that time period since then, they've had this whole mechanization, large-scale machinery brought in, imported from the industrial area of the world to this area of Ecuador, and they have made it into a rather modern, at least in some ways. Technologically, it's modern. Culturally, I found it very feudal. F-E-U-D-A-L. Not F-U-T-I-L-E. And that's an interesting arrangement, because we have a notion, or we had a notion back when I was a graduate student, and to some extent some authors still have this notion, that if you apply the same technological arrangement, you'll get the same kind of culture coming from it. In other words, if you have industrial societies around the world, the peoples involved in those industrial societies become very similar to one another. And that's not true. In this case, in the case of my own study, it shows that Ecuadorians were able to retain a very distinctive set of notions about what's appropriate social relationships on such an extensive, in terms of the size of the plantation and the kinds of organization of the labor force or managerial force, or the ownership. It was owned by very wealthy people, and etc. So that's the kind of thing that I once focused on. In more recent years, my focus has been on HIV. I've gone from economic anthropology, before it was called economic anthropology, to medical anthropology, which when I was a graduate student didn't exist. People studied things medical back then, but there was no separate subfield. Now it's one of the major subfields of anthropology in general, or of cultural anthropology in particular. And in that context, what I focus on is not the virus. In fact, when I started my studies, they didn't even yet know that it was caused by a virus. There are some people today, not anthropologists, who would tell us it's not caused by a virus, that HIV is caused by other things, by something else. And I don't need to go into that. It's really not relevant to this course, and I don't need to bash anybody the first day of class. But that's quite a change in career. If you think, it's almost like having a whole coming of age, if you will, going from economic anthropology and the study of plantation systems, the study of a Latin American society and culture, or subculture, because obviously being on that plantation in Ecuador was very different than being a member of, say, some subculture in an urban context in Ecuador, be it in the time frame that I studied Ecuador or even in the current time. Very different. But again, my anthropology is very different than from the osteological analyses that Dr. Story does, or the lithic kinds of studies that Dr. Widmer does, or the kinds of linguistic analyses sometimes that Dr. Rasmussen does. She teaches 2 courses in linguistics for us. Unfortunately, we don't have a full-time linguist at the current time in our department, because it is an important, extremely important subfield of anthropology, and that's one of the ways in which our department, I think, is deficient, at least in terms of traditional departments. In terms of a working operational department, our department is just fine, thank you. But, you know, we could use a linguist if somebody were from on high were willing to give us one. And someone could do those Comanche studies of baby language or something. Or would it be Comanchean? I don't think so. I think it would just be the way I said it first. And then there's another field that I haven't even touched about, of someone in our department who, Dr. Brown, who, you know, his career also spanned 2 different time frames or conceptual frames or areas of interest and focus in anthropology. In archaeology. And his went from a study of this concept he developed called ports of trade in Guatemala, which was much more, I think, traditional kind of archaeology, of excavation, and taught to him by, again, also Dr. Sanders at Penn State University. And then later on in his own career, he's moved away from that, partly due to political turmoil in Guatemala and what kinds of excavations one could do freely there and could not do as government problems intervened, or political problems intervened. And then he switched to a whole different notion of archaeology, not in the sense of basic concepts, because I think archaeology in this sense, like anthropology, is anthropology, archaeology is archaeology. But he really developed another subfield which is relatively new as a distinctive subfield, and his kind of anthropology now is very different than all these other kinds of anthropologies I've kind of spelled out for you this morning. His anthropology is called historical archaeology. And you say, why in the world does anybody need historical archaeology? Well, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. If he ever gives a public lecture, which he often does, on his work either here in Brazoria County or his new area of excavation in the area, at least of the Gullah-speaking people of South Carolina, go to it. You'll be fascinated. You'll be drawn to it just as I am, and that this realization that archaeology has finally grown up, and that's an in-joke, based on those notions of those trays of potsherds from that southwestern archaeologist that was such a tedious course. But anyway, his archaeology is really exciting. I consider it so relevant to these other studies in anthropology I've talked to you about. I see that culture come alive, and what he does is he excavates the materials in these so I have that interest. It's common to us. Plantation systems. He looks at a plantation that existed in Brazoria County, and he's also now beginning to look at this plantation in area, at least in terms of a slave plantation, what it was originally, in South Carolina, and he's able to bring it through the various periods in history, especially those centering on pre-Civil War, during the Civil War, and post-Civil War. And then he can compare what he finds with historical documents that are associated with those same time frames. And sometimes the documents and the archaeological excavations support one another mutually, and sometimes they contradict one another. And, the scientific evidence, the archaeological evidence, better said, refutes or disagrees with, at least its implications, from the historical documentation that occurred at the time. But again, if one remembers that historical documentation was primarily done by the educated class, by people who had greater access to power and resources, then they're not necessarily going to give us the point of view of what life was like for the person, in some cases in his work, who were slaves, and in other cases after slavery or before the Civil War. So again, this is all very different kinds of anthropology. The only one I've left out so far in any great detail is the work of Dr. Rasmussen in Niger, and her study of female healers there. It's fascinating work, but it's still very different anthropology than all these others that I've talked about. And all these people you can take courses from. They are a part of what our Department of Anthropology is involved in. And all of these people, like myself, went to a certain university, were trained by certain faculty, and have a certain grounding or basis in anthropological perspective, and have a subfield of specialization, and even smaller in the subfield of specialization. They go even more refined, more definitive than that in terms of the area of research that they focus on and do. And I find all of it interesting. I think one of the things that I really like about anthropology is I may not want to sit there and do that lithic stuff that I was kind of teasing about earlier, but the kinds of things that you can say about that when you see Dr. Widmer take those kinds of seemingly minutiae of detail and translate that into a discussion of the evolution of, I think it's Calusa culture. I got the name right. I may have the name wrong, but that's in the southeastern United States, and how that chiefdom kind of culture is very important in talking about the evolution of culture throughout the Circum-Caribbean. It wasn't just limited to the southeastern United States. You can follow that form or that structure of society into Venezuela and that area of the Caribbean, into the islands in the Caribbean area of the world. And so in that sense, then, it has important implications for discussing the entire evolution of society and culture in that part of the world. The same way you can take those notions of Comanche baby language, if you're a linguist, and you can see what that generates for you about what anthropology means in terms of the development of language, and what that specialization means. It has greater importance than my original accounting of it. Or if we looked at Dr. Story's reconstruction of that skeletal evidence of the man who had been burned in some kind of incident. It's not just about morbidity and mortality and what children died of versus adults. It's not those. It's you take those facts and you reconstruct, you recreate a much larger picture of what those people are like and are about. And that's where, all of us can read it and get inspired or get drawn to the field of anthropology. I won't talk about my own work now and what it may do to you in terms of its impact, but also, say, the area of historical archaeology Dr. Brown has developed, or the area of medical anthropology that Dr. Rasmussen has developed. And one person I forgot, Dr. Hutchinson, who also does work with me, not in terms of we haven't always worked together, but we've both worked on HIV. AIDS. But she looks at it more from the biological aspects of it, and I have looked at it more from the cultural aspects of it. In her involvement with HIV, when Janice, Dr. Hutchinson, first came to us, she was primarily concerned with blood pressure and those kinds of characteristics among some Caribbean peoples, and what kind of generalizations or generation of anthropological ideas she could make from that. And her career has also become transformed in the time that she's been here. And in becoming involved with HIV, she has become, I don't know if any of you have ever heard this lecture that she gives, or I assume she has more than one, but the one I've heard, and she gave in my applied anthropology class seminar one time, a graduate seminar, was the work that she did with condom use among African American young people in Houston, and the kinds of implications that her study was having for the development of, say, prevention of the spread of the HIV among different peoples of our own city. In this region, our own area of Harris County and in Houston, Texas. Fascinating work and well presented, and again, one that if she ever gives a talk on that particular aspect of her studies, you'd be sure and want to go to it, because it has relevance to you as young people today who are sexually active. I'm assuming. If you're lucky, you're sexually active. But it's okay if you're not. Abstinence is always good. So anyway, looking at all these anthropologists, I think you can see right at the beginning that none of them are really that similar to each other. But there is something that draws them all together, that they're all in the same department, that they all have, they can talk to one another. And I can recount their areas of research and their areas of specialization, and it has relevancy to me. It doesn't have relevancy for the kinds of studies I've done. I mean, for example, Dr. Widmer's study doesn't speak to my studies, or I could have used any one other person in our department, but it does speak to anthropology itself and that concern of anthropologists. So again, all of this relates to those original questions that I presented to you, and that is that anthropologists have always been concerned, have always posed these overarching, overconnecting concerns about what is universal about one human being with all other human beings, or one human culture with all other cultures, or in terms of prehistory and history. What is there about human behavior that's universal? What does it mean to be human? That's what human nature refers to. The other set of questions has to do, what makes human beings different from one another? What are the bases for cultural diversity, or even subcultural diversity? A notion that was made prominent in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And has relevancy today as well, obviously, since a lot of us talk about cultural diversity today. But cultural diversity is different today than it was back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Today it means something like, what is ethnic diversity? That's what becomes the buzzwords, or the but it's the same set of concerns, really, when you strip away those labels or those appellations. All right, there are other themes that I hope come out in the course in terms of looking at us as a, anthropology as a general discipline, and that is that not only do we have this great breadth of the discipline, but we also have, at the theoretical level, this constant shift between a naturalist, scientific, materialist notion of the universe versus a humanistic notion of the universe. It's like a pendulum. It swings back and forth. One generation of anthropologists are on the materialist side. A succeeding generation of anthropologists are on the humanistic side. It doesn't mean the humanists don't talk to the materialists and the materialists don't talk to the humanists. I actually see them as part and parcel of one another. One informs the other. Each succeeding generation of humanistic perspectives has something that we know to call them humanistic, even though they may say things very differently and they seemingly have very different concerns. But they're really not that different once you strip away some of the apparent difference in their perspective and look at what makes it humanistic. You see there is a continuity. But at the same time, they were mostly trained by anthropologists who were materialistic in their approach and view of anthropological studies. And I may have given you a misnotion at this point, and I want to correct it now. Even though today, current anthropological thinking seems to be about postmodern or post-structural kinds of notions, a humanistic form. By and large, the greater number of anthropologists to this day are still materialistic in their their feelings about anthropology and anthropological ideas. It's the ones who get the press, who get the anthropological press, are the ones who are postmodern and post-structural, because that's the newest thing on the scene, and usually the newest gets the most attention. But the other kinds of anthropology, the other kinds of perspectives of anthropology, continue to have currency and continue to have great importance. And a lot of people, I mean, if you take any one anthropologist and you look at their entire body of their work, they are somewhere on that continuum between science, or again, materialism, and a humanistic approach, or if today we would call it a postmodern approach to anthropology. All right, theoretically, we can identify this shift between natural science and humanism as the shift that's identified as one between materialism and humanism, and it's directly connected with the historical philosophical argument concerning the nature of reality. I can remember, and I'm not going to tell you today, but maybe you can look it up for yourself. You know, I had a course in philosophy when I was a philosophy major that I actually learned why someone asked the question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And while I found that intriguing in the moment, when its significance lost me once I left the classroom, because I thought, why would anybody ask that question in the first place? Angels don't dance on the head of a pin. An assumption about anthropology, this is another theme, an assumption about anthropological knowledge that I think exists across the generations, and from that first set of concerns that we call cultural evolution, or the cultural evolutionists, has been an assumption. And that assumption is there's some kind of connection or interconnection between culture, technology, and environment. Those are some of the basic premises of this course, in the sense of these are what anthropology is about. And again, to repeat them for you. There is this basic interconnection between history and the anthropology that's produced. And in some ways, there's between the anthropologies produced and the history that evolves. It goes in both directions. There's also this characteristic of anthropology that forcibly marks its identification and whom they have become and what they write about. And that is the breadth of anthropology as a discipline. It includes all those disparate kinds of anthropology that I just kind of detailed for you. If we were in a different department, I could have detailed everything differently. But it still would come out to be a department of anthropology, and you would, as students of anthropology, see those connections and see the relevancy that is there. There is a continual shift between natural science and humanism as a background kind of philosophical context in which to embed or discuss anthropology and anthropological notions. And there is a constant shift going from one side of that continuum to the other, be it from humanism to materialism or materialism to humanism. Any one anthropologist at any one time is somewhere in the middle. There is no anthropologist that's totally humanistic and no one anthropologist that's totally materialistic. Anthropologists, say, of the archaeological persuasion, who are extremely scientific in the kinds of evidence they want to portray for you, and even that southwestern archaeologist, Dr. McGregor, who only wanted to talk about potsherds, at some time or another had to move away from that to a generation of a discussion about what Mogollon culture and life was about, and why those decorative techniques and those evidenced in those pottery sherds had some kind of a relevancy, and in terms of tracing connections of diffusion among other peoples in that same area. And then, and finally, this notion that there is this connection between culture, technology, and evolution. If you can just focus on that one and retain that one, it will carry you through a lot of the discussions about theory in this course. There's always a set of remarks in any anthropologist's writings somewhere about culture and its interrelationship with technology and its interrelationship with the environment. Next time, We will be talking about 19th century anthropology. We will be concerned with evolution as a concept. At first, in terms of talking about evolution as a general concept, not biological Darwinian evolution, but more cultural evolution. And I will try to detail to some degree how in the early 19th century, people in the United States at least, this was primarily, interestingly enough, a theological argument, and it later became a scientific argument. So, with that set of comments, I think we are finished, if I can believe the yellow light up there. I think that's what that means. So, thank you very much for your attention. And by the way, I hope that you all attend class. Sean is going to be taking attendance. It's because that later on, I hope it's not just me, and I hope you feel free to ask questions. And by the way you ask questions is by hitting one of those things on your microphone in front of you. It not only activates the microphone, but it changes the monitor so I see you, and you get to ask the questions, etc. So, okay, great, and I'll see you on Thursday.